The first time I dropped a glass, I told myself it was exhaustion. The second time, I told myself it was the new shoes, half a size too small, pinching my heels raw. By the third time, when the rocks glass slipped clean out of my hand and shattered against the brass footrail, sending a spray of ice and amber liquid across a stranger's $2,000 shoes, I stopped making excuses. My hands were shaking. They had been shaking for 6 weeks, ever since I'd packed a duffel bag at 2 a.m. and left Daniel's apartment without turning on a single light, terrified that the click of a switch would wake him. Charlotte. Marcus, the bar manager, said my name the way you'd say it to a dog that had just chewed through a couch cushion. Not angry, exactly, just tired. That's the third one this week. I know. I'm sorry. I'll cover it out of my tips. It's not about the glass. He lowered his voice, glancing toward the man whose shoes were now soaked in bourbon. The man hadn't said a word. He hadn't even looked at me. He was staring at his phone like nothing had happened at all, like a woman hadn't just nearly fallen into his lap reaching for a towel. It's about you. You're somewhere else lately. You're here, but you're not here. He wasn't wrong. Some nights I caught myself glancing at the door every time it opened, my pulse spiking before my brain even registered who walked through. Some nights, I dreamed about a hand closing around my wrist hard enough to bruise, and I woke up with my own fingers pressed white against the sheets, like I was the one holding on for dear life instead of trying to pull away. The Velvet Room wasn't the kind of bar that hired women like me. 26. No real bartending resume. A gap of 4 months in my work history that I refused to explain in interviews. It was the kind of place with a doorman who checked names against a list, where the bottles behind the bar cost more than my old monthly rent. I'd gotten the job because the previous bartender quit without notice, and Marcus was desperate, and because I'd lied, convincingly, I think, about having worked somewhere downtown that didn't actually exist. I needed the cash. I needed the kind of job that paid in tips at the end of the night. No direct deposit. No paper trail that could lead a determined man back to an address. I wiped down the bar with more focus than the task required, watching my own hands instead of the room, the way I'd trained myself to do. Don't make eye contact with anyone who looks like they could be him. Don't laugh too loud. Don't stand near the windows. 6 weeks of rules I'd built for myself, brick by brick, until they felt less like fear and more like a second skin. That was when the air in the room changed. I felt it before I understood it. The way the noise dipped, just slightly. Conversations trailing off mid-sentence the way they do when someone walks into a room who matters more than everyone already in it. I looked up without meaning to. He was tall, dressed in a black suit so perfectly tailored it looked less like clothing and more like something he'd been poured into, the collar of his white shirt open at the throat. Dark hair swept back from a face that belonged in a magazine I'd never be able to afford. There was a tattoo creeping up from beneath his collar, intricate and dark, disappearing beneath his jaw. The only thing about him that looked the slightest bit dangerous. Until I noticed the 2 men flanking him, broad-shouldered, eyes scanning the room the way mine did, except theirs moved with purpose. Theirs moved like they were looking for threats instead of avoiding them. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't have to. The hostess practically tripped over herself, leading him toward the private booth in the back corner. The one Marcus always kept reserved. The one I'd never once seen used in the 2 months I'd worked here. "Who is that?" I asked under my breath, not really expecting an answer. Marcus's jaw tightened. "That's not someone you ask about. That's not someone you serve either. I'll handle that table myself." "Okay." I didn't push. In my experience, when men told you not to ask questions, the answer was usually something you didn't want to carry around in your head anyway. I went back to my section, back to the rhythm of pouring and wiping and smiling at strangers who tipped well because they liked watching a woman pretend to be fine. It was almost 10 o'clock, the crowd thickening, when a man in his 50s leaned across my bar with the kind of smile that made my skin crawl on instinct, the kind I'd learned, Too late, but I'd learned it. To recognize before the words even came out of someone's mouth. "You're new," he said. "I haven't seen you here before. I'd remember a face like yours." 6 weeks, I said, keeping my voice light, professional, the voice I used like a shield. "What can I get you?" "Whatever you're having." He reached across the bar, not touching me, but close. Close enough that I had to step back. Close enough that the old fear flared bright and hot in my chest. The kind that made my ears ring and my vision tunnel. For one disorienting second, the bar wasn't the bar anymore. It was Daniel's kitchen, his hand closing around my arm, his voice low and reasonable in a way that was somehow more frightening than yelling. "I think you should order something," I said, and my voice cracked, just slightly, just enough. He laughed, low and pleased with himself, like my discomfort was a game he was winning. He reached again. This time his fingers actually grazed my wrist, and the glass I was holding, mid-pour, slipped from my hand and shattered against the bar top. Vodka and shards sprang across the dark wood. The sound cut through the noise of the room like a gunshot. I froze. My hands were trembling so hard I could see it, could see the way the bar lights caught the shake in my fingers, and for one humiliating, paralyzing second, I thought I might actually cry in front of a room full of strangers who'd already forgotten me. "I am so sorry," I said, dropping to grab a towel, my voice unsteady. "I'll clean this up right away. I'm so sorry. Move." The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was quiet in a way that somehow carried farther than shouting would have, low and even, the kind of voice that didn't ask twice because it had never needed to. I looked up. He was standing at the end of the bar. Up close, he was even more unsettling than he'd been from across the room. Not because of anything cruel in his face, but because of how still he was, how completely contained, like a held breath. His eyes moved from the broken glass to the older man's hand still hovering near where my wrist had been, to my face, in that exact order, cataloging something I couldn't read. The older man's smile vanished. He straightened up so fast he nearly knocked over his own bar stool. "Ji-hoon, I didn't realize..." "You didn't realize what?" It wasn't a question. Ji-hoon, so that was his name. And the way the older man flinched at the sound of it told me everything Marcus hadn't raised his voice at all. He didn't need to. The 2 men who'd flanked him into the room were suddenly there too, close, silent, their presence doing the talking his voice didn't have to. "I was just..." the older man started. "You were just leaving." Ji-hoon's gaze flicked toward the door, and that was the whole sentence. The man practically ran. I stood there with broken glass at my feet and my heart slamming against my ribs, not from fear this time, but from something stranger. The dizzying disorientation of watching a room rearrange itself instantly around one man's quiet displeasure. Marcus appeared from nowhere, already apologizing, already promising the next round on the house, already speaking to Ji-hoon in the careful, deferential tone you'd use with royalty, or with someone who could end your life with a phone call. Ji-hoon didn't answer him. He was looking at me. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His accent was faint, careful, like English was a coat he wore well, but hadn't been born wearing. His eyes, dark, unreadable, and far too attentive, moved over my hands, my face, like he was checking for damage he expected to find. "No," I said too fast. "I'm fine. I'm sorry about the noise. I'll have this cleaned up in..." "I didn't ask about the noise." He crouched, just slightly, and for one absurd second, I thought he was going to help me pick up the glass himself, a man in a suit that probably cost more than my car kneeling on a bar floor. He didn't. He simply looked at the shards scattered near my feet, then back up at me, and something in his expression shifted. Not softer, exactly, but more focused, like I'd become a problem he intended to solve. "You're shaking. It's cold in here." It wasn't, and we both knew it. He didn't argue. He just held my gaze a beat too long enough that I felt the heat crawl up my neck, long enough that Marcus cleared his throat awkwardly behind me and asked if Jihoon wanted his usual table. "In a minute," Jihoon said, without looking away from me. And that was the moment I understood, with a sinking, electric certainty that whatever had just happened, the broken glass, the silence that fell over the entire room, the way one quiet word had sent a grown man fleeing for the exit, I had just become something Jihoon intended to pay attention to. I didn't know yet whether that made me safer, or whether I'd just traded one kind of danger for another. He didn't go to his table for almost 10 minutes. He stood there, hands in his pockets, watching me sweep up glass with a dustpan I'd grabbed from behind the bar, and the strangest part wasn't that he watched. Men watched me all the time, in ways that made my skin itch. It was that he didn't say anything else. He just waited, like patience cost him nothing, like time bent around him instead of the other way around. "You don't have to stand there," I finally said, sweeping the last of the shards into the pan, not looking up. "I'm fine. Really. I know you're fine." His voice was even. "I'm not standing here because I think you're not." "Then why?" He didn't answer that. Instead, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a card and set it on the bar, not handing it to me, just placing it there, deliberate, like he didn't want our hands to touch. "If that man comes back, you call this number. Not Marcus, me. I don't even know you. You know enough." A faint, almost imperceptible curve touched the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. "You know, I told him to leave, and he left." I picked up the card despite myself. It had nothing on it but a phone number, no name, no business, nothing that would mean anything to anyone who found it in my pocket. I should have thrown it away. I told myself I'd throw it away the second he walked to his booth. Instead, I slid it into the front pocket of my apron, against my hip, and felt its weight there for the rest of the night, like a stone I'd swallowed. He went to his table. Marcus brought him a drink he hadn't ordered. Clearly Jihoon had a usual. Clearly this was a routine that predated me by a long time. And the two men who'd flanked him took up positions near the booth, one facing the door, one facing the room, neither of them drinking, neither of them sitting. I told myself I wouldn't look at him again. I lasted maybe 20 minutes. He was watching the room the way I'd learned to watch rooms myself, except where my vigilance came from fear. His seemed to come from something else entirely. Something more like ownership. His eyes moved over every table, every exit, every face, cataloging, assessing, the way you'd check a house for unlocked windows. Twice, his gaze landed on me, and twice I looked away too fast, heat climbing up my throat for reasons I refused to examine. By the time my shift ended at 1 a.m, my hands had finally stopped shaking, for the first time in 6 weeks, if I was honest with myself. I told myself it had nothing to do with the man in the corner booth. I told myself a lot of things that night that didn't survive contact with the truth. I walked home, the way I always did, 3 blocks to a studio apartment above a laundromat that smelled permanently of fabric softener and steam. I'd chosen it because it was cheap and because the building had no doorman, no list of names, nothing that would tell anyone who came looking that Charlotte Reyes lived there now, instead of the woman she used to be. I didn't see the car at first. It was parked half a block from the bar, engine running, headlights off. I only noticed it because I'd trained myself to notice things like that. Cars that idled too long, men who stood too still, the particular quality of silence that meant someone was watching. My stomach dropped before my mind caught up. Daniel drove a silver sedan. This one was black. That single detail was the only thing that kept me walking instead of running, kept my pace steady instead of breaking into a sprint that would have announced exactly how afraid I was. The window rolled down as I passed. Charlotte Reyes. The voice that said my name wasn't Daniel's, and the relief that hit me was so sharp it nearly buckled my knees. I turned, and one of the men from Jehoon's table, the one who'd faced the door all night, was leaning slightly out the window, expression unreadable. "Mr. Jehoon asked us to make sure you got home safe." "I didn't ask for that," I said, my voice sharper than I meant it. "No," the man agreed. "He didn't ask you either." I stood there on the sidewalk, somewhere between offended and unsettled, and beneath both of those things, something I hated admitting to myself. A strange, traitorous warmth, the kind you feel when someone notices you exist after months of feeling invisible. "Tell him I don't need protecting." "I'll tell him you said that." The man's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "He won't believe it, but I'll tell him." The car didn't follow me the rest of the way, but I felt watched until I got my door locked behind me, and for once the feeling didn't claw at my chest the way it usually did. It felt different, strange and unfamiliar and infuriatingly almost comforting. I didn't sleep well. I dreamed. Not of Daniel for once, but of dark eyes that didn't blink, of a quiet voice asking, "Are you hurt?" like the answer actually mattered to him. He came back the next night, and the night after that. By the end of the week, it had become something I didn't examine too closely. The way I started arriving 15 minutes early to make sure my section was perfect before he walked in. The way Marcus had quietly, without ever discussing it, started reserving Jehoon's table exclusively for me to serve, the way I'd started memorizing the particular rhythm of his arrivals, the dip in noise, the way the hostess straightened her spine, the two men who came in first to check the room before he ever stepped through the door. "You're playing with fire," Marcus told me on Thursday, restocking limes with more force than the task required. "Men like that don't notice waitresses for fun, Charlotte. They notice them because they want something. He's never asked me for anything. He doesn't have to ask." Marcus's eyes were tired, older than his 30-some years. That's the whole point. Men like that don't ask. They just take eventually when they decide it's time. I thought about that more than I wanted to admit. I thought about Daniel, too. About how he'd never raised his voice in the beginning either. How the control had crept in slowly, disguised as care. As "I'm just worried about you. As I just want to know you're safe." Until one day I woke up and realized I hadn't made a single decision in 8 months without calculating his reaction first. I knew what possession dressed up as protection looked like. I'd worn its collar for 2 years. But Jehoon was different in a way I couldn't articulate. Not yet. He never asked where I lived, though I suspected he already knew. He never touched me, not once. Not even the casual brush of fingers other men managed to find excuses for. He simply watched, and waited, and left a card in my apron pocket that I still hadn't thrown away. And somehow that restraint felt more dangerous than anything Daniel had ever done with his hands. On Friday night, the bar was slammed, 3 deep at every rail, and I was moving so fast I barely had time to breathe between orders. That was when I saw him. Not Jehoon, but a face I would have recognized in a crowd of 1,000 people. A face that had haunted 6 weeks of half-sleep and flinching at car doors. Daniel was standing just inside the entrance, scanning the room. The glass in my hand slipped before I even registered I'd dropped it. He hadn't found this place by accident. He'd been looking. He'd probably been looking for weeks, calling every bar in the city, showing my photo to doormen, peeling back the city block by block the way he used to peel back my excuses, patient and methodical, and absolutely certain that I belonged to him whether I agreed or not. His eyes found mine across the room, and even from 30 feet away, I felt the old fear lock around my throat like a hand. "Charlotte?" he said, loud enough to carry, loud enough that heads turned. "There you are." I couldn't move. 6 weeks of careful distance, of changed numbers and unlisted addresses and a duffel bag packed in the dark, and he'd found me in a single sentence, standing in the doorway like he had every right to walk back into my life and collect what he believed was his. I didn't see Jehoon stand up from his booth. I only became aware of him because the entire room seemed to shift again. That same dip in noise, that same instinctive deference rippling outward. Except this time, his attention wasn't on the room. It was on Daniel, and it was on me. I don't remember deciding to step backward. My body just did it, the way it had learned to do over 2 years. Make yourself smaller, make yourself a target that's harder to hit, get something solid between you and him. My back found the edge of the bar before my mind caught up with what my legs were doing. Daniel was already moving toward me, weaving through the crowd, with the easy confidence of a man who'd never once considered that he might not be welcome somewhere. He looked good. He always looked good. That was the cruelest part of him. The way he could walk into a room looking like the safest man alive while every nerve in my body screamed otherwise. Charlotte. He said my name like an apology and a command in the same breath, a tone I'd know in my sleep, in my grave probably. Do you have any idea what you put me through? 6 weeks. 6 weeks of not knowing if you were alive. You knew exactly where I wasn't, I managed. My voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded thin, far away, the voice of someone standing at the edge of a cliff. That was the point. That's not fair. His expression cracked into something wounded, something that used to work on me, that used to make me apologize for hurting him, even when he was the one who'd left bruises shaped like fingers on my arm. I've been worried sick. I just want to talk. 5 minutes, Charlotte. You owe me 5 minutes. I didn't owe him anything. I knew that, somewhere in the rational part of my brain that 2 years of conditioning hadn't managed to fully silence. But knowing it and feeling it were different animals entirely, and my body was already bracing for the old dance, the apology, the placating, the small surrender that always felt safer than the alternative. She doesn't owe you 5 seconds. The voice came from beside me, close enough that I felt it more than heard it over the noise of the bar. Jehoon had crossed the room without my noticing, his 2 men a step behind him, and he was standing now at my shoulder. Not in front of me, not blocking me like a shield, just beside me, like he understood instinctively that I didn't need rescuing, so much as I needed to not feel alone. Daniel's eyes flicked to him, assessing, the way men like Daniel always assessed other men. For size, for threat, for whether they could be talked over or around. Whatever he saw made something flicker behind his eyes, a recalculation. This isn't your business, whoever you are. This is between me and my girlfriend. I'm not your girlfriend. The words came out of me sharper than I expected, sharper than I'd managed in 2 years of small, swallowed protests. Something about Jehoon's stillness beside me, the sheer unbothered quiet of him, made room for my own voice to exist for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. I haven't been your girlfriend in 6 weeks. I left, Daniel. People who want to talk to someone don't have to track them across a city. Charlotte, you heard her. Jehoon's voice hadn't risen at all, but something underneath it had changed, gone colder, quieter in a way that made the hair on my arms lift. She said she's not your girlfriend. I'd suggest you don't make her repeat herself. And who exactly are you? Daniel's jaw tightened, the first crack in his composure. The first glimpse of the man who used to slam cabinet doors hard enough to make the dishes rattle when I didn't agree with him fast enough. Her new boss? Her new boyfriend? You don't know anything about her. You don't know what she's like, what she does, the things she's lied about. I know she dropped 3 glasses this week because her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Jehoon's eyes didn't leave Daniel's face. I know exactly why, so I'd think very carefully about what you say next. The bar had gone quiet around us in that particular way I'd learned to recognize, the way a room goes quiet when something is about to happen that everyone wants to watch and no one wants to be part of. Marcus had appeared near the end of the bar, phone in hand, his thumb hovering over the screen, clearly debating whether the situation called for the police or just a polite request for everyone to leave. Daniel's gaze swept the room, really took it in for the first time, I think, registered the two men standing perfectly still near the booth in the back, the way every member of the staff had gone tense and watchful, the way the entire bar seemed to be holding its breath around this one specific man at my shoulder. I watched something shift in his expression. Calculation. Daniel was many terrible things, but he wasn't stupid, and stupidity had never been his particular flavor of danger. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty, had gone thin at the edges. He was already backing toward the door, already recalculating, already deciding that whatever this was, it wasn't worth the price of finding out. "Charlotte, you can't just disappear from people's lives. We're not finished." "We've been finished for 6 weeks," I said. "You're the only one who hasn't noticed." He left. I watched him go, watched the door swing shut behind him, and felt my knees nearly give out from the sheer release of adrenaline that had nowhere else to go. I gripped the edge of the bar to keep myself upright, and it was Ji-hoon who noticed, Ji-hoon who put a hand, not on me, never quite touching me, just hovering near my elbow like a question he wasn't asking yet, to steady whatever I needed steadying. "Sit down," he said quietly, "before you fall down." "I'm fine." It was the same lie I'd told him 5 nights ago, and apparently it landed just as poorly this time, because he didn't move, didn't back away, just waited with that same maddening patience until Marcus brought a stool around the bar himself and physically guided me onto it. "Who was that?" Ji-hoon asked, once I was sitting, once my hands had stopped their violent trembling and settled into something closer to a tremor. "Nobody." I stared at the bar top, at the water rings left by 100 forgotten glasses. An X. That wasn't an X. His voice was flat, certain, the voice of a man who dealt in dangerous people for a living and recognized one on sight. That was someone who thinks he still owns something. I didn't answer, because there wasn't an answer that didn't require admitting things out loud I'd spent 6 weeks trying not to say even to myself. "Did he hurt you?" Ji-hoon asked. Quieter this time. Different. The question wasn't curiosity. It was something closer to a man gathering facts he intended to use. "It doesn't matter now. I left. It matters." He crouched slightly, the way he had with the broken glass that first night, bringing himself level with me instead of looming over me the way Daniel always had, even when he wasn't trying to. "Charlotte, look at me." It was the first time he'd used my name. I hadn't told him, which meant he'd known it before tonight. Had probably known it since the first night. Had probably known a great deal more about me than a card with a phone number suggested. "How do you know my name?" "I know a great many things." His expression didn't shift, didn't apologize for the admission. "I know you've worked here 8 weeks, not 6, though you tell people 6. I know you left an apartment on Cordell Avenue in the middle of the night with 1 bag. I know the man who just walked out of here has called 4 different bars in this city looking for a woman matching your description." The room tilted slightly. "You looked into me." "I look into anyone who matters to me." He said it simply, without apology, the way other men might say I check the weather. "It became clear the first night that you mattered." I should have been furious. I should have felt invaded, exposed, hunted in a different way than Daniel had hunted me. And some small, rational part of me did feel that, distant and quiet beneath everything else. But underneath the fury was something else entirely, something that scared me more than the violation itself. Relief. The bone-deep relief of being seen by someone whose attention came with consequence, whose interest apparently came with the kind of protection that made grown men flee a room without a single raised voice. "What do you want from me?" I asked, and my voice came out smaller than I meant it to. Jihoon studied me for a long moment, dark eyes unreadable in the dim light of the bar, the tattoo at his throat disappearing into the open collar of his shirt, like something half revealed, half promised. "I want you to stop being afraid," he said finally. "I haven't decided yet what that's going to cost either of us." He didn't explain what he meant, and I didn't ask. Some sentences are easier to carry around unexamined, the way you carry a lit match without looking too closely at how close it is to your skin. For 3 days after that night, Daniel didn't come back. I told myself it was over, that whatever fear had crossed his face in the bar had been enough to send him crawling back to whatever life he'd built without me. I almost believed it. I'd believed worse lies about him before, and survived them. On the 4th day, Marcus called me into the back office before my shift, his face unusually serious, a folded piece of paper in his hand. "This came for you." He held it out like it might bite him. "Slid under the front door sometime last night. No name on the outside." My fingers were cold unfolding it. I recognized the handwriting before I finished reading the first line. Daniel's careful, deliberate cursive, the kind he used to leave notes on the refrigerator that read like apologies and threats, stitched together so seamlessly I'd never been able to tell which was which. "You think hiding behind some gangster changes anything? I know where you sleep, Charlotte. I've always known. I was being patient. Don't mistake my patience for forgetting." I read it 3 times before the words stopped swimming. My hands had gone past trembling into something colder, stiller. The particular numbness that used to settle over me in the last months with Daniel whenever I understood, all over again, that there was no version of leaving that didn't eventually require a fight. "Charlotte." Marcus's voice cut through the static in my head. "You need to call someone. The police, a lawyer, something." He hasn't done anything they can arrest him for. I'd learned that lesson already, 18 months ago, sitting in a precinct that smelled like burnt coffee, while an officer explained, not unkindly, that a raised voice and a tight grip weren't enough, that the law mostly cared about what happened after the bruise had already formed. I thought about the card in my apron pocket. I'd carried it for 8 days without using it, telling myself it was a last resort I'd probably never need. My fingers found it before I'd consciously decided to call. Jihoon answered on the 2nd ring. "Charlotte." Just my name. Careful, like he already knew this call wasn't a casual one. He left a note. My voice cracked on the 2nd word. "He knows where I live. He's been watching. He must have been watching for days to know that." "Where are you right now?" "The bar. I'm working in 20 minutes. Stay there. Don't go home tonight. Not even to get clothes." His voice hadn't changed pitch, hadn't risen, but something underneath it had gone hard in a way I recognized now, the way I'd heard it the night he told Daniel not to make me repeat myself. "I'm sending Sung to bring you somewhere safe. Trust him. I can't just leave my apartment. You can, and you will, because the alternative is a man finding you alone in a building with no security and no witnesses." The bluntness of it landed like cold water. "I've seen men like him before, Charlotte. I know exactly what a note like that means. It means he's done waiting." I didn't argue further. Some part of me, the part still raw from 18 months of learning what happened when I didn't take warnings seriously, recognized the truth in what he was saying faster than my pride wanted to admit it. Sung, the quiet man who'd faced the door that first night, picked me up after my shift in a black car with windows tinted dark enough that I couldn't see out, and presumably no one could see in. He didn't make small talk. He drove with the careful, watchful attention of someone who treated every red light as a potential ambush, checking mirrors with a frequency that would have seemed paranoid in anyone else, and seemed, in this context, entirely reasonable. The building he brought me to wasn't what I expected. I'd braced myself for something ostentatious, something that announced wealth the way the suits in the cars did, but it was quiet instead, unmarked. The kind of place you'd walk past 100 times without noticing. Jihoon was waiting in the lobby when we arrived, and the moment I stepped through the door, Something in his posture shifted, some tension I hadn't realized he was carrying releasing all at once. "You're all right." It wasn't a question. "I'm all right." This time, when I said it, it was actually mostly true. He led me upstairs to an apartment that felt strangely lived in for a man I suspected didn't spend much time anywhere. Books stacked on a low table, a worn leather chair angled toward the window, the kind of details that didn't fit the careful, controlled image he presented to the rest of the world. He noticed me noticing. This is one of my places, not the one people know about. He said it like an explanation, though I hadn't asked. "You'll stay here until I understand exactly what we're dealing with." "We?" "You didn't think I was going to send you back out there alone, did you?" Something almost like amusement touched his mouth, gone as quickly as it came. "I told you the first night. If he came back, you were supposed to call me, not handle it yourself. I'm not used to being someone else's responsibility." The words came out rawer than I meant them to, edged with old defensiveness. The last man who decided I was his responsibility ended up deciding I was also his property. Something shifted across Jehoon's face, not offense, but a kind of careful, deliberate recalibration, like he was rewriting something in real time. He sat down across from me, putting deliberate distance between us, the same instinct he'd shown every single night at the bar. "I'm not him," he said quietly. "I understand why you'd think the two things look the same from where you're standing. Possessive, controlling, a man who decides things about your life without asking." He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. "But there's a difference between a man who wants to own you and a man who wants to make sure no one else ever gets the chance to hurt you again. I know the difference matters less from the inside. I'm asking you to believe it anyway." I didn't know how to answer that, because some traitorous part of me, the part that had felt strange relief in a black car outside my apartment a week ago, already believed him, and that belief terrified me more than Daniel's note ever could. "Why does this matter to you?" I asked instead. "I'm a bartender you've known for 2 weeks. You don't owe me anything." He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of silence that suggested he was deciding how much truth the moment could hold. "My sister was married to a man like him," he finally said. Quiet, patient. The kind of dangerous that doesn't show up as a bruise until it's too late to leave safely. I was 13 when I understood what was happening to her, and too young to do anything about it. By the time I was old enough to do something, it had already gone too far. His jaw tightened, the only outward sign of whatever this cost him to say. "I don't let it happen again. Not when I have the power to stop it. Not anymore." The weight of that landed differently than I expected. Not as an excuse, not as a manipulation dressed up in tragedy, but as the truest thing he'd told me since the night the glass shattered against the bar. It didn't erase my caution. It didn't erase the lingering instinct that told me to be careful of any man whose attention came with this much gravity, but it gave his protection a shape I could finally understand, something rooted in old grief instead of new hunger. "What happened to her?" I asked quietly. "Your sister. She's safe now." His eyes met mine, steady, certain. "It took longer than it should have, and it cost more than it should have. I don't intend to make the same mistake twice." Outside, the city moved on without us. Indifferent to the quiet conversation happening 11 floors above the street. Indifferent to the note still folded in my coat pocket. Indifferent to the fact that somewhere out there, Daniel was almost certainly still looking. "He won't stop," I said. "You don't know him. He doesn't stop." "Neither do I." Jehoon's voice was calm, certain, final. And unlike him, I have considerably more reach. The days that followed had a strange, suspended quality, like time itself was holding its breath. I didn't go back to my apartment. I didn't go back to my shifts at the bar either. Jehoon arranged that without asking me directly, simply telling Marcus I'd be unavailable for a while, and Marcus, to his credit, didn't ask follow-up questions. I stayed in the quiet apartment with the worn leather chair and the stacks of books, and for the first time in 6 weeks, I slept through the night without waking at every sound the building made settling around me. On the third day, Sung came to find me in the small kitchen, where I'd been making tea I didn't really want just to have something to do with my hands. "Mr. Ji-hoon would like to see you. He has news." News, in this context, could mean almost anything, and my stomach tightened the whole walk down the hallway. Ji-hoon was standing by the window when I came in, his back to the door, the city spread out gray and quiet below him. "We found him," he said, without turning around. "Daniel. He's been staying at a motel 2 miles from your old apartment, watching it most nights." My hands went cold around the teacup I was still holding. What does that mean? What happens now? He turned to face me, and there was something different in his expression, something I hadn't seen before. Not the careful stillness he wore like armor, but something more deliberate, almost gentle. "It means you have a choice to make, Charlotte. I can make this disappear the way I make most problems disappear. Quietly. Permanently. In terms of his ability to find you again. You'd never have to think about him for the rest of your life." That sounds like a threat dressed up as a gift. It's an offer. His jaw tightened slightly. "Not a threat. I would never make that choice for you without asking. That's the entire point of asking." I set the teacup down, my hands finally steady enough to do it without rattling the saucer. "What's the other choice?" "The legal one. Slower. A restraining order with actual evidence behind it this time. The note, the testimony of half a bar full of witnesses who heard him refuse to leave you alone. A private investigator's documentation of him watching your old building for the better part of 2 weeks. It's not as clean. It's not as fast. But it's yours. You'd be the one who ended it, not me." I understood, standing there, what he was actually offering. Not just safety, but the thing Daniel had spent 2 years stripping away from me one small decision at a time. Agency. The right to choose my own ending, instead of having it chosen for me by someone bigger, louder, more certain of his own authority over my life. "The second one," I said. "I want to be the one who ends it." Something that looked almost like pride moved across his face. "I thought you might say that." "You're not disappointed?" I'd have been disappointed if you'd asked me to handle it for you." He stepped closer, the distance between us shrinking for the first time without either of us flinching away from it. "I told you once. I'm not interested in owning your decisions. I'm interested in making sure you're never again in a position where someone else gets to make them for you." It took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of meetings with a lawyer Ji-hoon's people had quietly arranged. Sharp, unflinching, the kind of attorney who specialized in cases exactly like mine and didn't blink at the request for discretion. 3 weeks of giving statements, of Marcus testifying about the broken glasses and the trembling hands he'd watched for 2 months, without fully understanding why. 3 weeks of Sung driving me to and from the courthouse in that same dark car, always one careful step ahead of any possibility that Daniel might be waiting somewhere along the route. The restraining order was granted on a gray Tuesday morning, the judge's voice flat and procedural in a way that somehow made the moment feel more real than any dramatic confrontation could have. Daniel wasn't even in the room. His lawyer had advised him. Apparently, that contesting it would only make things worse, that the note alone was damning enough to end any argument before it started. I walked out of the courthouse into thin autumn sunlight and felt something in my chest unclench for the first time in 8 weeks. Ji-hoon was waiting at the bottom of the steps, hands in his pockets, watching me with an expression I'd started to recognize over the past month. Careful, restrained, like a man permanently bracing himself not to want too much out loud. "It's done," I said, and my voice didn't shake. "It's done," he agreed. We stood there for a moment, the city moving around us, indifferent and ordinary, and I realized I didn't feel the old instinct to scan the crowd for a familiar silver sedan, didn't feel my pulse spike at every man who walked too close. The fear that had lived in my chest for 2 years had finally, quietly, packed its bags and left. "What happens now?" I asked. "With us, I mean, whatever this is." Jehoon considered the question with the same careful weight he gave everything. "I'm not going to pretend my life is simple, Charlotte. The men in the bar that night, the security, the reasons people flinch when they hear my name, none of that goes away because the worst part of your life finally did. If you want nothing to do with that world, I'll understand. I won't follow you the way he did. I'm not interested in being a different version of the same cage. And if I don't want to walk away?" Something in his expression eased, just slightly. The first unguarded thing I'd seen from him since the night the glass shattered against his shoes. "Then I'd like to take you somewhere that isn't a bar for once. Somewhere quiet. I'd like to know what you order when you're not the one pouring the drinks." I thought about the 8 weeks behind me, the duffel bag packed in the dark, the trembling hands, the card I'd carried in my apron like a secret I wasn't ready to admit I needed. I thought about a man who'd never once raised his voice, who'd asked before he acted, who'd told me about his sister with his jaw tight and his eyes steady, who'd offered me violence and offered me patience in the same breath and let me choose the slower, harder, truer one. "I'd like that," I said. "Coffee. Somewhere with too many plants and not enough parking." The corner of his mouth lifted, a real smile this time, brief and almost startled, like he hadn't expected to feel this particular kind of lightness in a long time either. We walked away from the courthouse together, not touching, careful with each other in a way that felt less like distance now and more like respect. Two people who understood, in their own different ways, what it cost to finally be safe enough to choose something instead of merely surviving it. Behind us, the city kept moving, indifferent and ordinary, and mine again. Ahead of us, for the first time in longer than I could remember, the path forward looked like something I'd actually chosen for myself. And for once, that was enough.